interest rate unchanged?
Look, I think it's the beginning of a larger discussion. As I mentioned before, we should be talking to the council. We should come to terms on this. This was a first cut to get something done. The mayor played a real leadership role in this, and we signed off on it. But there's no question that is part of your due diligence and budget negotiations. This is a wonderful opportunity for you and the mayor to continue what was built on, and I'll work with you on it 100%.
Great. So I wanted to just get a sense, I think your testimony was very helpful today and I agree with much of what you said, but what are the metrics that you think are most important to determine the city's fiscal health moving forward? What are the things that we should be looking at to determine what our fiscal health is like as we are trying to recover?
Well, it's a broad question, but I could give you some historic perspective. This is not our first rodeo, or this is certainly an unprecedented situation. I would go back to the fiscal crisis in the 70s and look at building the broadest coalition and a broadest package of relief, both to our communities hardest hit, but also looking at a real savings plan, coming up with a coalition to go to Washington to get the money we're owed. There's a lot in our history that could put you going forward. When you look at the Great Recession and the moves that the council and the mayor had to make, again, there's a historical perspective here. Right now, I think the biggest challenge for us is federal stimulus dollars. We must get that money. Without it, we are in a permanent hole that I'm not sure we can get out of. Second, we've got to stave off those state, my friend. Let me say, we have to stave off state cuts. We don't know what's coming that way. So we have to be very prudent in terms of savings, agency efficiencies. I come to the council every year and I say, please save, as if our city depends on it. It's hard to get people to think about saving when times are good. When I came to the council in February and said save in good times, I didn't realize that 2 weeks later we would be in the midst of something that who could have imagined how dire this would be economically. But I do think we need to do everything we can to show Washington that we're ready to take action. Every dollar that we spend now must have a measurable impact on the city. If we have a program, it has to show results. If we can save by getting rid of outside contracts, bloat at the different agencies that we've long talked about, I think we can create a base of money for 20 and 21. And then all hands on deck, Washington working with Gillibrand, Schumer, working with our great congressional delegation. That is how I would approach in the short term at the economy of closing budget gaps. Obviously, turning on the economy is going to be a much more intense, serious conversation. My view is that we should use science as our friend and medical advice or medical expertise. That's why I have a problem moving contact tracing out of the Department of Health, because we've got a health department and expertise. And I think there's a lot that we can do together to open up this economy slowly and carefully, because obviously lives will depend on the decisions we make, and we have to figure out what our risk tolerance is through the lens of what's medically appropriate.
And what if, Mr. Comptroller, what if we don't get the federal money that we're all fighting for by the end of June statutory?
Notice he doesn't talk about bloat at all. Just ignored that whole part about bloat and savings and tax cuts and it's just amazing. And agencies, now they don't even list the agencies now. They just say the agencies that we've long talked about. Interesting.
Deadline, we have to pass a balanced budget by state law. So if we don't get those billions of dollars that was put in that House bill that the House passed a little more, than a week and a half ago, what do you think we should do if that money doesn't come through before July 1st, and we have at least an $8.5 billion hole in our budget? What's your suggestion on what we should do?
Well, my view is you have to operate on two tracks. So right now, the mayor has presented to you a budget for your review. And again, the budget that we get through in between now and adoption in 2020 is obviously has to be separated in some part to 2021. So I believe that you have to balance this budget. You can get there with the money that we have. Obviously, we want more. 2021 is a whole other fight, and we're going to have to use every tool at our disposal in 2021 if we don't have enough federal aid. It's hard to imagine that we wouldn't have federal aid. It would just be unprecedented. Probably would have meant we lost the election and the House. But let's assume that we don't get what we need. Well, things have to be on the table. You know, if the state is going to cut services, and we are then going to have to ask the wealthiest people to do a little more and step up. There's a lot of ways to pass a budget. It cannot be a budget balanced on the backs of the frontline workers, the heroes, the people who sacrifice their lives. We cannot do that. That is always the default. That's why I have a problem with cutting the after-school program. Why would we first go after the kids? They had nothing to do with this, and yet we start cutting their futures. That's why I had a problem with the mayor talking about furloughs and layoffs. There's 10 steps between now and 2021. Don't scare the people who are risking their lives. Let's look at agency efficiencies. Let's look at outside contracts. By the way, I will send you, not that I expect you to read it, I wouldn't, but I've done 418 audits. We've identified close to $1 billion in potential savings. Let's review those documents. Maybe the audits that we did would be relevant for your budget negotiations. The important thing now is we don't want to hurt direct services for the poorest people. We want to keep city workers working. We already have close to 930,000 unemployed people. We don't want to add to that, but we're going to have to be very strategic in budget negotiations, both this year, which I think you'll get through, and the next year is the big question.
But I'm a little confused. My understanding is the budget deficit that we are talking about right now, that you identified and that your office agrees on, is the $8.6 billion or whatever the exact number is in a budget hole. That is what we have to contend with over the next 6 weeks. We're going to have to pass a budget that closes that hole, not just the sort of $2.5 billion of lost revenue in the current fiscal year that we're in. But unless we get that federal money before July 1st, we are going to have to close an $8.5 billion hole, at least, maybe more than that. It could be closer to $10 billion as the IBO is projecting in the next 6 weeks. So that's part of where I'm asking for your sort of guidance and feedback and help is if that money doesn't come through and we have to potentially cut or find $8.5 billion to $10 billion worth of savings over the next 6 weeks, what areas do you think that we actually should be cutting when we're presented with those difficult decisions to total that amount of money, to total $8.5 billion? It's going to require us to make some painful decisions, and I'd love some feedback on what you think some of those decisions should be.
Sure. And well, let me assure you, when you review the mayor's budget, you'll find that it covers the $8.7 billion gap. That's a combination of PEGs, federal aid, and the reserves. So that's there. If we have to go further, you got to look at more efficiencies. You got to look at more PEGs. There's a lot more fat in that budget. The council members, the budget dance is going to look a little different than it usually does. And, you're going to have to make some tough decisions on your own. But I can tell you right now, the mayor's spending plan covered that $8.7 billion. When you review the budget, you'll see that. But there will be more that we have to do if we don't get the federal aid we need. And that's just a reality of the situation.
Are there any potential cuts that you think that we should make on specific things?
How much time do you have?
I have time.
All right. Well, let's start looking at the money that we spend on outside consultants and a bloated bureaucracy at the DOE, for example. Take a look at our agency watch list.
Wow, DOE, that's Department of Education.
We put out on corrections and DOE and a whole host of city agencies. We have to look at the Thrive program and say, look, if it's not producing results, that's got to be a real cut.
Thrive NYC, that's the mayor, that's Shirlane.
There's a lot that we can do to get to that budget without hurting vital services. So basically, because we never engaged in a PEG program, Mr. Speaker, in 7 years, there is a lot of fat in this budget. That's the bad news and the good news. I do believe we can create a real PEG program. I think we really should find efficiencies. I did this in my office. I said, look, let's look at how much money isn't just in the office that we're not utilizing right now. So we gave back millions of dollars to OPB, and they asked us for it, and we gave it to them. And then I said, well, wait a minute, that's just a one shot. Let's go through a PEG program in our office. Can we give money back without putting more people unemployed, cutting payroll? Because I do believe we don't want to put more people on the unemployment line. And you know what? We did it. We have a 4% PEG. And I think we should urge, and I think you should urge as part of the budget negotiation, to get agencies, when you have your hearings, to come up with a spending plan. I think every elected official should do it. I think we'll find, because we weren't pegging over the last 7 years, we were spending at a great rate, that maybe that's a way of moving the budget forward. So as we don't get federal aid, there's a lot of steps. I've mentioned a few of them for you, but obviously I think we can get to a federal aid package that could stave this off. But if not, the mayor has prepared a budget that is fiscally sound as far as we have analyzed so far.
Well, I look forward to working together. I think that during this really hard time, it's really crucial that all of us work together in unity to figure out how we can, responsibly look out for, as you identified in your remarks, but also in answering some of the questions today, how do we look out for the most vulnerable? How do we look out for the hardest hit communities? How do we continue to lift up our essential workers? And I would welcome the ability to work together in that way, and working with your office on things that you all have identified, as you said, through audits that have been done and through other pegs that you've identified that you think that we should be looking at. And one area that I do think would be great for your office and the council to work together would be the Department of Education on the outside consultant contracts, which total hundreds of millions of dollars. And for years, you have been saying, and we have been saying, that we need to look at those. The proposed cuts that the mayor put forward in his executive budget, proposing, coupled with the loss of state money for education, would see a tremendous loss of dollars for classrooms, for children, for teachers. And we think that there are other ways to identify savings and cuts that will not impact the classroom, that are things that you mentioned, which are DOE outside contracts and consultants, other things. I think you mentioned, and we've mentioned before, some of the clawback provisions in the bus contracts that exist. So I think those are some areas that we could work together on. I will just end with this, and then I'll turn it back to Chair Drum. I know that you announced, I think it was either last week or the week before, that the Bureau of Audits recently sent a letter to First Deputy Mayor Fullahan seeking further information that the city had related to COVID-19 prior to March 22nd's stay-at-home order that was done by the governor, and seeking information related to dissemination of that information to and among New York agencies and officials. Essential questions, which I think are important that we ask, about who knew what and when did we know it and how did that go.
Oh my goodness, it just goes on and on. Good luck to everyone. You can see that it looks like the blind are leading the blind here.